Hello, so let's continue. We'll be now reading the docs on GitHub Actions about using filters. Let me switch the view, and now we can continue on how to use filters in our YAML files. So, using filters. Some events have filters that give you more control over when your workflow should run. For example, the push event has a branch filter that causes your workflow to run only when a push to a branch that matches the branches filter occur. Instead, when any push occurs. Okay, so we have a cat today. Yeah. Anyways, so we have here example. So on our push event we can define a branches filter, and then we can either trigger the workflow on our main branch or the branch that fits this filter, the releases one. Okay, let's go further. Using filters to target specific branches for pull request events. When using the pull request and pull request target events, you can configure a workflow to run only for pull requests that target specific branches. Okay, so we have repeated the information. Use the branches filter when you want to include branch name patterns or when you want to both include and exclude branch names patterns. Use the branches ignore filter when you only want to exclude branch name patterns. You cannot use both branch and branches ignore filters for the same event in a workflow. You cannot use both. Okay. If you define both branches and branches ignore, paths and paths ignore, the workflow will only run when both filters are satisfied. Okay. So we have a end condition here for branches and branches ignore. Which it makes sense. I want to define a specific branch, so I want to, for example, run tests on release branch, but not release something an alpha, which we're gonna see later on in the documentation. The branches and branches ignore keywords accept glob patterns that use characters like asterisk, double asterisk, plus, question mark and exclamation mark, and others to match more than one branch name. If a name contains any of these characters and you want a literal match, you need to escape each of these special characters with //////. For more information about glob patterns, see the workflow syntax. Okay. Example including branches. The pattern defined in branches are evaluated against a git ref name. For example, the following workflow would run whenever there is a pull request event for a pull request targeting a branch name main, a branch name mona octocat, a branch whose name starts with releases. So yeah, on pull requests we want to see these branches. Okay, so maybe let's copy this code and use it in our repository, which we already have. So we would like to have this changed. And we don't need the strategy matrix and the steps we used previously. Is there something that I would like to go? Hello, let's echo hello world. And yes, so this will only trigger when we when we create a pull request to branches like main or releases, right? Let me check on which branch I'm currently. So instead of pull request, maybe let's make it a push event. Okay, I'm currently on branch main, so let's check out the other branch. Right, and let's add it, commit change, git commit, check event, maybe workflow trigger on other branch, and if we understand it correctly, other branch does not fit this requirement, so it shouldn't, this action shouldn't be triggered. Okay, let's just push. What? Problem with copying. Okay, so we pushed our changes to our other branch. We have a job build which will echo hello world. Let's go to our Git and see our actions, and the last action was triggered 2 weeks ago, so let's do the same thing. Git check out main. Okay, git check out. Let's create some release branch, maybe from this branch. Git check out. Let's create a branch which will be named releases 1, and we're gonna push this branch and see if this will fit to our filter and trigger the workflow. Okay, I was able to push it. And after refreshing the page, I can see that here's the filters work correctly. My action is working over here. We have a single step build, and it should, as said before, echo the hello world. Okay, so let's continue with the talks. In a workflow, if a workflow is skipped due to branch filtering, path filtering, or commit message, then checks associated with that workflow will remain in a pending state. A pull request that requires those checks to be successful will be blocked from merging. Yeah, so I switched the pull request event to push event, so I could check the filtering working on push event instead of pull request. But yeah, I can also trigger workflow on the pull requests. Excluding branches. When pattern matches, the branches ignore pattern, the workflow will not run. The patterns defined in branches ignore are evaluated against the git ref name. For example, the following workflow would run whenever there is pull request event, unless the pull request is targeting a branch name mono-octocat and a branch whose name is releases * alpha. So yeah, let me just add here branches ignore, and let me commit the changes. Previously this workflow triggered on this branch, but now the ignore filter should ignore this push event on this branch. So let's check it out. Actions. The last one was number 10, which ran 2 minutes ago for 8 seconds, and we don't see any new action in our actions tab. Okay, seems correct. Including and excluding branches. You cannot use branches and branches ignore to filter the same event in a single workflow. If you want to both include and exclude branch pattern for a single event, use the branches filter along with the exclamation mark character to indicate which branches should be excluded. If you define a branch with exclamation character, you must also define at least one branch without the exclamation character. If you only want to exclude branches, use branches ignore instead. That's interesting. Why did they decided to make it to allow the configuration of the filters in two different ways, using branches and branches ignore, or just branches with exclamation character? Because trying to do the same thing in two different ways, it's not a good idea in my opinion. But on the other hand, if we would try to run a workflow with branches and branches ignore but not on release alpha, they would have to fit both. Well, maybe the reason for that is because the branches filter might have many more options added to it. But on the other hand, you could also add many more branches names or patterns to branches and to branches ignore. So yeah, that's interesting. Did they implemented one way of defining it in the past and wanted it to keep backwards compatible? Afterwards they added the glob patterns, or was there any other reason for allowing a two-way of configuration the same thing if it's actually the same? Third, that you define your pattern matters. The matching negative pattern prefixed with exclamation mark after a positive match will exclude the git ref. A matching positive pattern after a negative match will include the git ref again. Okay, so it works differently. This explains it works differently. When we use branches and branches ignore, we would have to have AND for both of the condition, and here we have a bit different. So the first definition is overwritten by the second definition. So yeah, it's different logic. Okay, the following workflow will run on pull request event for pull requests that target release 10 or release beta noma, but not for pull requests release 10 alpha or release beta 3/alpha. Because the negative pattern follows the positive pattern. Okay, yeah, so the second or the later pattern will override the first or the predecessor pattern. Using filters to target specific branches or tags for push events. When using the push event, you can configure a workflow to run on specific branches or tags. So, except from branches, we will use tags to we are just filtering, so we are just repeating ourselves and nothing to comment here. Use the branches filter when you want to include branch name patterns or when you want to both include and exclude branch names patterns. Use the branches ignore filter when you only want to exclude branch name pattern. You cannot use both, so we already have read that twice at least. Use the tags, and then we have use the tags ignore, and that's the repetition of what we read before. We are just using tags instead of branches. If you define only tags or tags ignore or only branches, the workflow won't run for events affecting the undefined git ref. If you define neither git tags or git ignore or branches ignore, the workflow will run for events affecting either branches or tags. If you define both, the workflow will only run when both filters are satisfied. That's not that easy to understand, so let's go through it slow. If you define only tags or only branches, the workflow won't run for events affecting the undefined git ref. If you define neither tags or branches, the workflow will run for events affecting the branches or tags. Either branches or tags. If you define both branch ignore and paths ignore, the workflow will only run when both filters are satisfied. So we are introducing now paths to the equation, but yeah, I'm not quite sure if I understand. Quite complicated. I would have to make some tests to understand how using tags, branches and paths together will affect the workflow. Okay, the branches ignore tags and tags ignore keywords, accept glob patterns that use characters, so we already know that from previous topic. The patterns defined in branches and tags are evaluated against the git ref's name. For example, the following workflow would run whenever there is a push event on the main branch, Mona Octocat branch, a branch whose name starts with release, like release 10, a tag name v2, and tags whose name start with v1, like v191. Okay, so this example is quite easy. I would like to see an example with, no, we have only an example with branches ignore and tags ignore patterns. The workflow will not run. The patterns defined in branches and tags are evaluated against the git ref name. For example, the following workflow would run whenever there is a push event, unless the push event is to branch name Mona Octocat, a branch whose name matches release alpha, tag name v2, and tag whose name starts with 1, like 1.9. Okay, so that's the same as previous example, but we are just ignoring these branches and these tag versions. Including and excluding branches and tags. You can't use branches and branches ignore to filter the same event in a single workflow. Similarly, you can't use tags and tags ignore to filter the same event in a single workflow. If you want to both include and exclude branch or tag patterns for a single event, use the branch or tag filter along with the exclamation character to indicate which branches or tags should be excluded. So we are repeating ourselves from the previous paragraph. When we were using the first rule, then the second rule overrode the first rule, and so on. Using filters to target specific paths for pull requests or push events. When using the push and pull request events, you can configure a workflow to run based on what file paths are changed. Path filters are not evaluated for pushes of tags. Use the path filter when you want to include file path patterns or when you want to both include and exclude file path patterns. Use the path ignore filter when you only want to exclude. You cannot use both paths and paths ignore filters for the same event in a workflow. You only want to both include and exclude path patterns for a single event. Use the path filter prefix with the exclamation character to indicate which path should be excluded. So yeah, that's the repetition of branches and tags. But what's interesting about paths, we can actually define the paths in our repository, which can be included or excluded. And that way, if we have a mono repo in which we have our front-end code and our back-end code, we probably can run back-end tests when there's a change in files in our back-end code, and front-end tests when there's a change in file in our front-end application in our mono repo. Or we can run probably both of the tests in both if both back-end and front-end application of our application change. And there is not much actually set. So including paths, if at least one path matches the pattern in the paths filter, the workflow will run. For example, the following workflow would run anytime you push a JavaScript file. And it's quite simple because it's a glob pattern for JavaScript files. Excluding paths, so we can use paths ignore, and you can actually provide a glob almost as same as your it in our git ignore files. All the files that are in docs won't trigger a workflow if we provide a path ignore with our docs directory, or if you want to call it folder, and marking everything what's in that folder with double asterisks. So an example to include and exclude paths. So again we have the exclamation character just like in branches and in tags. On our push event we can define the paths, and if we provide exclamation mark to a glob pattern, the second defined glob pattern will overwrite, will be checked after the first one, and yeah, eventually be ignored. Okay, I guess that's enough for today. So what we have learned today, we have learned about the filtering of branches with branch and branch ignore, tag and tag ignore, and path ignore, and how to use them. So next time we will read about the git diff comparison, and to be honest, let me check, maybe I'll read it today, because I can see here is another heading, so I guess this heading is worth reading today. So let's just read those paragraphs now and check what do they have in to tell us. If you push more than 1000 commits, or if GitHub does not generate a diff due to a timeout, the workflow will always run. The filter determines if a workflow should run by evaluating the changed files and running them against the path ignore or paths list. If there are no files changed, the workflow will not run. GitHub generates the list of changed files using 2.diffs or pushes and 3.diff for pull requests. Pull request 3.diffs are a comparison between the most recent version of the topic branch and the commit where the topic branch was last synced with the base branch. Pushes to existing branches. A 2.diff compares the head and base SHA directly with each other. Pushes to new branches. A 2.diff against the pattern of the ancestor of the deepest commit pushed. Diffs are limited to 300 files. If there are files changed that aren't matched in the first 300 files returned by the filter, the workflow will not run. You may need to create more specific filters that the workflow will run automatically. So we can actually about comparing branches in pull requests. Okay, 3.diff a. So actually there is a filter that allows us to use the git diff option. Yeah, but it sounds quite complicated to me. I would expect for diff to just compare the differences by using the SHA directly, but here are some advanced options which we can configure and use in our workflow. I don't actually see a usage for this. Quite interesting. I'm not sure how could I use it. The paths allowed me to define which files in which directories or folders, if you want to call them that, have changed, and on that trigger a workflow. So different parts of code can trigger different workflow, but the number of diffs, the number of files in a difference in a commit, I don't see a use for this. Yeah, if you know, I might be missing something. I have not seen I have not seen usage of this in my career so far. So yeah, leave a comment if you know how to use it. And I guess for today it will be enough. Later we will continue using the filters to target specific branches for workflow run events. And I have not yet read this documentation, so I cannot tell you what this will be about. So yeah, thank you.